We are going to examine required and optional properties and the maximum length property associated with our EF Core DB context. For each one of our entities, we can associate these data annotations or Fluent API initialization inside of our project. So a property is considered optional if it is valid if it contains a null. If null is not a valid value to be assigned to a property, then it's considered a required property. By convention, a property whose CLR type can contain null will be configured as optional, whether it's a string, int, or a byte. Properties whose CLR type cannot contain null will be configured as required. So you can use data annotations to associate a required type or implement it via Fluent API. So let's go ahead and examine the required attribute associated here. So you can come over here to your address class right here, and you can put the data annotation to associate required. So right here we can type required, and then we're going to have to pull in the namespace associated with the data annotation. So we can use system.componentModel.data annotation. So right there, that's going to associate this attribute of city being required once you implement your CRUD operation to associate with this entity in your SQL Server database. Another way to implement this is, as we did before, is go to the Fluent API side, is come over here, and I already have it right here that says required. So let's put model builder associated with our parameter dot entity, as we did before, and we want to associate the address entity, and then we want to close this out here and say property, and we want to say as a lambda expression x dot city, and then we can say attached to that is required. So this is a way to implement that with the Fluent API when it's generated. So this is one way to do it, where we can implement it with the Fluent API inside of our onModelCreating method. This is the required attribute associated on the entity itself with the data annotation attribute required on our specific property, or we can implement it the same way with the Fluent API to associate this property when the onModelCreating method is called. The other item that we're going to address is the maximum length property. Configuring a maximum length provides a hint to the data store about the appropriate data type to use to a given property. Maximum lengths can only apply to array data types such as string and bytes. By convention, it is left up to the database provider to choose the appropriate data type for the properties. For properties that have a length, the database provider will generally choose a type that allows the longest length of data. For Microsoft SQL Server, you can use nvarchar max for string properties, or nvarchar 450 if the column is used as a key. So as we stated before, we can use the maximum length property to associate inside of our entity. In the same way we did it before, we can come up to one of these items, and we could say right here, let's say we want to go to the zip code, and we want to put right here the property, max length. Inside of the max length attribute, we can associate the number of characters. So in this case, let's put 500. So now we have a max length associated with 500 right here. The other way we can do it, as we did before, is go to our DB context, and we can just put right here the same thing, model builder dot entity. We can put address. We can come over here, put this, say property, and we could do the same as we did before. Let's do z dot, and we're going to put in this case what we have, which is the zip code, and we want to say max length, and then inside of the max length we put the number of characters as we did here. So this is the other way to implement the max length. I'm showing you both demonstrations consistently so you can look at it any way you want to implement it. So in this case, you can put the data annotation for max length as the same as we did the required attribute for the property on our entity. And we can come in here into the onModelCreating method and implement the required attribute to the specific property utilizing the Fluent API, or we can configure the max length for the specific property on our entity inside of the onModelCreating.